Hello. Am I heard?
Yep.
Okay. Can you please chat, please? Thank you. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. It makes no sense that in order to pursue the economic order, you have to inflict mass famine and economic difficulty onto already struggling states with already difficult governments to work with. We would suggest that while opening government to some extent explains why the economic order is important, they don't explain why it is important to the extent that we are willing to impose sanctions, tariffs, embargoes on actual countries in order to just fulfill that precise goal. What I'm going to do at Leader of Opposition is first give an explanation on whether or not it is true that over time the world economic order has become actually as inclusive as opening government asserts. The second thing I'm going to do is explain how it creates immediate harms. The second thing I'm going to do is explain how it's counterproductive to actually achieving the global economic order, and also a discussion on whether or not the global economic order is automatically and absolutely good as implied by the Prime Minister. First, let's question the characterization that is, hinged upon by the entirety of Prime Minister. Is it actually inclusive? The first thing you need to note is that empirically, a lot of the leading countries that go against the world economic order, like China, like Russia currently, are those, for example, precisely who do not subscribe to it. It is still within the hands of a lot of these Western, very Yank, very British, or for example, institutions that still subscribe to certain specific ideas that of intellectual property that specifically serve their interest that I'm going to talk about later. But second, it's also other forms of empirical evidence. For example, how China currently was able to liberate themselves from the current world economic order precisely because they broke the rules. And even until now, they do a lot of currency manipulation. They do a lot of intellectual property violations and other things that precisely do not adhere to the specific things that Prime Minister wants at the end of the day. So what this generally means is that if a lot of the arguments from Prime Minister are very hinged on believing that it's very inclusive, we're not stepping on the economic realities of other countries, that's absolutely ridiculous and very untrue down to the frame. The first thing we want to argue is how it creates immediate harms. Dion says that the economic order is very important, but we identify that they don't explain why it is important to the extent that we are willing to impose tariffs and sanctions onto actual vulnerable countries. The first thing I want to say is that this will not change much. If anything, it will further incapacitate a lot of these countries that are often have high poverty density by the fact that they have belligerent governments that are often in developing nations, for example, or with governments that are authoritarian to the detriment of people's livelihoods. What does happen? The first thing that happens is that you get worse inflated prices, but as a result of, for example, like tariffs, the cost of living inflates, for example, often to the detriment of people that are just trying to put food on the table. The second thing is, for a lot of the key industries of these belligerent countries, they will have a very difficult time actually making profit or revenue. Because, for example, the ability to sell raw materials, agriculture, and all of these similar goods becomes significantly difficult insofar as you further insulate them from the rest of the global economy. The third thing you need to note is that it is not on principle their fault that the state is belligerent. Often, because if the state is belligerent, they are because the actual powers that are undemocratic, people we cannot necessarily politically trust. And as a result of that, it's not necessarily the fault that the people on the ground have to suffer, because let's be real, the leaders of these countries aren't the ones that are going to feel the strongest brunt of these sanctions, these tariffs, and these embargoes. The next reason you have to identify is that it also increases dependency on the black market. For example, violate intellectual property, or for example, how a lot of people sell a lot of things illegally in order to avoid a lot of the stuff that we're imposing as a result of the policy from government. What this means is that you worsen their economic capacity, not just to be able to survive or put food on the table, but also to be more okay with obliging with the stuff that comes from the world economic order. Before I proceed, POI, from Paula.
Yeah, so why do countries violate rules of economic global order?
So I'm going to explain that later. The first quick answer to that is sometimes the way that these things are constructed are directly opposed to their own interests. is that they may not align with, for example, the people that created these policies. The second thing I want to argue is that this is counterproductive to the global economic order, assuming this is something you want to achieve. The first thing you want to note is that it entrenches a lot of the stuff that government wants us to go away from. So, for example, if you further close out an entire national economy as a result of these, impositions or economic warfare that you're doing, you're further likely to entrench the local economies, allow the people within that local national economy to have a deeper reliance on the belligerent state or, for example, the national elite, which goes against a lot of the stuff that government wants. The second thing is that you also force belligerent states to coalesce. So, for example, we have currently powering belligerent states like China and Russia coalescing with each other, gathering the different countries that are also being rejected because those countries, as a result, for example, of the degree to which they are impoverished or disadvantaged or developing, for example, can also not subscribe to the World Economic Order. What are the structural reasons for why they are likely to coalesce as opposed to, for example, give in to the demands of the World Economic Order? The first reason is often because as a result of imposing a lot of this economic warfare that results to active like tensions and aggression and a lot of people suffering on the ground, you sever ties between people who agree with the World Economic Order and people who currently do not agree with the World Economic Order. And this specific lack of trust through such an act of aggression is very likely to allow them to be okay with discussions, with negotiations, talking about, especially when they have strongman leaders who often don't back down. What this means is that you foster victimization of belligerent states as well as anti-Western sentiment that results in things like them pulling out of international trade agreements or, for example, isolating them from the rest of the world politically, which is terrible on an economic and political front. The last thing we want to argue is the global economic order automatically or absolutely good? There are three things you need to note. The first thing is that a lot of these global economic orders, much to, in contradiction to what PM is arguing, is that they're often written by Western institutions as they identify. And I don't necessarily agree that they provide structural reasons for why these things have changed or are continuing to change. The second thing is that even if it's not written by them, they often have the political facilities in order to enforce it. So, for example, they are often the ones that have the most representatives in international economy or international geopolitics, for example, and therefore make up most of the say on how exactly we should execute the World Economic Order. The third is that a lot of the way it is created is in favor of Western-centric interests. So, for example, the Monsanto farmers in India precisely were deprived from being able to do their own agricultural operations because those that were creating the intellectual property precisely put a patent on the precise seeds that they were making that hindered them from being able to benefit from the stuff that they do. What does change as a result of government policy? The first thing is that there is little to no change because of the lack of trust and the isolation that you impose on a lot of these countries as a result of economic warfare. The laws still exist and they still exist to be in favor of the West. The second thing you do is you decrease the likelihood of negotiation. So if the interest is over time, we want them to liberalize, it's precisely through economic warfare that you don't get to achieve that. The third thing you do is you also deprive a vast majority of people, especially those on the ground, for a means of survival. And insofar as the goal is that we want people to have order and we want people to be happy, I don't think you achieve that in a world wherein you deprive them from having food on their table.
And then the leader of opposition for a fine speech. Maybe have the Deputy Prime Minister extend Eight.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. All right, I'm gonna start my speech in three, two, one. Two things. One, this will not achieve their goal. Two, I will question the global world order and explain why when it is good, there are natural incentives to follow it, but when it significantly hurts you as an individual country, there are reasons it's okay to be able to go against it. Number one, why doesn't this work? The first is they say sanctions are going to be targeted and therefore they reduce the harm. The first thing is this contradicts their point, i.e. if it's targeted, then they can't get a bunch of people to do regime change. But secondly, is that belligerent states are precisely the hardest to isolate because they know they are belligerent and oftentimes they hide their assets and their cash in places where that are globally disconnected from the financial system. And that's what makes it harder to be able to do this. But secondly, is that it's impossible to separate leaders from people. And the important thing to note here is that you're not punishing leaders, you are punishing policies, i.e., you are punishing them for not opening things up, for currency manipulation, and doing things with IP. The problem here is that when you are specifically targeting these government policies, you make it harder for everyone that is affected by them. I.e., if you start to damage a currency or you do a speculative attack on a currency, that affects everyone holding that currency and most especially the people in most need. And for doing things like IP violations, if you're going to do things like reduce the supply that you have for important industrial production factors like tractors, etc., and agriculture, that affects food prices significantly within a country. So if ever you don't want to look petty and want to actually target the policy in question, then it's clear that it's going to harm people. But say you only actually want to target leaders. The problem is that, especially in belligerent states, where the problem is things like not opening up the economy, power and wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few. And what that unfortunately means is that economies are dependent on them entirely because they are the main employers. They control a significant number of businesses, etc. And so if you hurt them and they go under, the people they are hiring in the large-scale contagion is a huge impact, right? That's why when we tried to isolate financial leaders from the global financial system, that also meant Russians were unable to withdraw from their ATMs. Thirdly, is they assume that you'll just die from this policy rather than potentially surviving by approaching Russia or China that has a history of this as well and are more likely to be kind to you. Note especially that there's an incentive to do this rather than capitulate because you look weak as a leader. The West attacked you and now you're going to back down and bend over. I think it is much more likely you are going to try and strike a deal, look like you got away from the West, blame the West and everybody else involved in this if it's not just the West to be able to get around this. Secondly, they say you're more likely to protest and revolt. Even if this is the case, I actually think there's so much missing here. Like one, why does the regime change assume it's going to be good? A lot of the time, we've seen revolts over and over again where dictators simply replace dictators. And that's because in the cases of revolt, oftentimes the people with the most power and are more likely to rise to the top are revolutionary, power-hungry individuals that have access to guns and weapons. And especially the people that are maybe the most passionate, maybe the most affected, etc., are the ones that are least able to participate in revolts because they are already hungry, because they cannot access the means to be able to revolt and are unlikely to have control. And therefore, just because there's a regime change doesn't mean it's a better regime change, but the collateral damage exists. And that's the second thing. There's an incentive to keep this protracted because you want to ensure that over time, when people get hungry and they cannot continue to fight, that they give up. And so the harm is not going to be a short-term harm. In fact, a lot of the time it is drawn out conflicts until people just accept that the government is not going to bend down. But thirdly is scale, right? So your harm here is that one country is damaging the whole global economic order, but it's not clear why them going back again is going to ensure everyone joins. And therefore, you are significantly damaging the well-being of one country without the assurance that there's a massive scale on the global level. Thirdly, how do cash-strapped countries act? Look at examples of countries we've historically sanctioned: Iran, North Korea, Myanmar. A lot of the time, nationalism becomes stronger because you feel like your sovereignty is under attack. strongmen leaders come to the top because they want to be the ones to say, we will not back down. We want to be able to fight them. But thirdly is you need a new promise because you can no longer provide economic prosperity as a promise to your people. What ends up happening is the threat and coercion of military and guns becomes much more powerful, and they use it as a way to maintain security as well. And what that means is that these cash-strapped countries don't think we should bend down and adjust. A lot of the time they switch their style of leadership to military dictatorships, or at least incredibly semi-authoritarian countries. Like that's what happened with Myanmar when we sanctioned them, and then Aung San Suu Kyi got taken out. Military dictatorship again. Lastly, this doesn't just harm the countries themselves, right? A lot of countries are incredibly economically interlinked with China, with Russia, etc. When you damage these countries by imposing tariffs on them, you significantly increase things like the cost they have for production, the ability for businesses to survive from those countries. And because these are strong exporting countries, even those compliant with the global world order are going to be harmed by higher prices of natural gas, are going to be harmed by higher prices of food, technology like that comes from China, etc. The harm is just too big here, and I don't think it achieves the benefit. I'll take CG.
If the economic harm to these states is so great, don't you think the leaders have an incentive to just capitulate, given that they don't lose much by just agreeing?
So what I'm telling you again is that they switch their leadership style that does not depend on the economy anymore, or they can survive, but it means allying with Russia and China. There are many options on the table here. It's still not clear why this is the option they take. Secondly, on the global world order. So I want to say there are so many incentives to take part in it. You cut costs of standardization by having something like the same currency that is pegged to everyone else. Secondly, is there's more confidence in investors. They'll give you patents because they know you won't violate IP properties. They want to be able to trust your currency, and they will because you don't manipulate it. Thirdly, is you don't want to be seen as belligerent because that's a significant risk. People might fly away, etc. What does this mean? Oftentimes, there are significant incentives to follow, and when people don't follow, it is a signal that the system does not work for them, or that they have no means of being able to change the system that already exists. And this hurts developing countries significantly, i.e., intellectual property laws ban farmers in India from being able to sow the seeds of their crop because they need to be able to buy new seeds from Monsanto, for example. What that entails is that when this is likely used is one where systems absolutely fail people. And to rebut the arguments on Western control, right? That people will pull out if the West doesn't include everyone. The first thing is that the historic institutions they name have been Western controlled for the longest time and therefore are not representative of everyone. Two is that the way you get votes is not one country, one vote like the UN. The IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions get votes by contribution. And so the wealthiest countries often benefit and have the most say. But thirdly, historical arrangements that they signed in the 60s and 70s have screwed them for years, and they cannot opt out of them because of historical arrangements. If you're not doing it, it's probably for a pretty good reason, likely Western control. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Maybe now, member of club, pick up the back and speak.
POIs in chat, please. We will forward two extensions in closing government. First, why belligerent economic policy can cause massive harm to small countries. Secondly, we're going to prove why the leaders of these countries will, in most cases, capitulate. But first, one point of framing. This usually doesn't happen with big states like with China. Why is this the case? Because big states usually have an independent economy that can resist sanctions. They have their own blocks, as OO says. They can rely on other states as well. And thirdly, they can just retaliate against you. This motion mostly happens with smaller states that go rogue due to political instability and cause massive damage to neighboring states because their economies are extremely interconnected. We are fine with taking the moral low ground and saying that if a big force bullies them into compliance, as long as this causes utility, this is a good thing. And this is where we meet a burden that OG doesn't meet, because OG does give generic reasons why it's good to have a global economic order, but I think LO is right to say that if they prove that the harm caused to the country that you sanction is greater than the benefits of the economic order, then OG can't win. Our first extension is on why belligerent economic policy causes massive harm that is as great, if not greater, than the one OO talks about. So what happens when one small state goes rogue and implements policies like protectionism and intellectual property violations? First, on protectionism. Protectionism can cause massive supply shocks. That's because companies within your country already have pre-existing trade deals and contracts with companies within the other country. So they rely on manufacturing from the products coming from your country. Their markets rely on your food, on your grain and stuff like that, which means when suddenly you pull back and put a protectionist policy in place, these supply chains crumble. This is especially true in neighboring countries because they tend to have similar geographies and similar demographics, which means there's a high degree of market consolidation already because companies can easily expand and sell to the same consumers. When companies suddenly downsize, this means that you will cause mass unemployment because your protection policies mean that people in the other state now will not be able to run their economy as smoothly. When people get unemployed, they can't pay their bills, they suffer all the massive economic harms that OO talks about, but then there is less confidence in the stock market because once your companies go bust, then you don't want to have further investments for new companies because investors don't know if you can grow in the future. But thirdly, when people do not have as much money because they are unemployed, they cannot support the other businesses as well, which means the GDP shrinks as a whole. Thirdly, when people spend money less because there is a crisis, there are no taxes for your social programs, so the government can't fund healthcare and can provide food provisions for the people who are poor. What this proves is that if you're acting economically belligerently, you directly harm the livelihoods of the people around you and you cause economic shocks in those states. This is also true when it comes to intellectual property violations because they can bankrupt like companies, because the way companies invest a lot of money into research and investment is because they know if I research a new drug, if I have a new invention, I will project high earnings because people have to buy my patent. If you ignore that patent, then you don't get the profit you expected, so your entire company goes bust. What this means is that we already have the economic harms that are always talking about, but within other states, and we can stop that harm if we prove that this is effective. So we already extend on OG on the urgency of this motion. And secondly, we just believe that principally it's okay to go for self-defense. Even if we harm the other states, even if we hurt innocent people in the process, if this is the way we defend ourselves from certain economic shock, it is principally justifiable to do this. But let's move on to the second clash, why this will actually work. How are states likely to use this policy? Because on Gov, we don't have the burden to defend a blanket use of this policy all the time. States are likely to use this policy as a last resort because of the reasons OO gives you. You might lose a trading partner in the future. They might lose a different trading bloc. They might retaliate against you politically or feed into the idea that you're harming them. So you're first likely going to try negotiation with them. Secondly, you're only going to do it if you predict it is likely to work. For instance, some states are small enough that they simply can't work without the supplies of the global economy. Some states do not have relations that are close with China and Russia to renege a deal quickly enough, and you're likely going to use it in those states. Even if we win in a select, in a select number of states, it still happens. We still have a delta versus the house. But the OO idea is that, now the people, or the OG idea, people within the state will revolt if the economy becomes bad enough. But they don't actually prove the leverage as to why you have power over some states to control them. We have 4 mechanisms here. Firstly, note that some countries simply do not have products in their domestic markets because they do not have the materials to produce them. So some countries are completely reliant on Western blocs to deliver sanitation materials for them because they can't produce them themselves. So if you cut them off, they have no choice but to capitulate. Secondly, you can harm their local manufacturing industry because many states rely on foreign materials to produce, like Taiwan needs microchips from America, so you can completely hold their GDP. Thirdly, poor states are often export-based, as OO says, because of the currency differences that exist. So if they can't export to the largest bloc, they're going to be economically impoverished very fast. Now, the OG strategy here is quite weird. They say, you will revolt against the state here. I don't think this is likely. I think it's much likelier for the leader to capitulate and to renege. Why is this the case? OO says, they're just going to change their leadership style to be more authoritarian and stuff like that. But note that this is unsustainable if you have a huge economic crisis that we uniquely proved on CG. Why? Because you need money to fund the military and to fund the police, to quench protests, to fight off militia groups and stuff like that. So you as the leader preemptively don't want this to happen because you can lose power. Additionally, you have less money to fund state media that can go against opposition parties. So it means that if you want to protect your image and not be voted out or not be killed, you preemptively want this not to happen. But thirdly, note, if you want to have a profit incentive to get rich, you can get richer if your economy is doing well because you can steal more money from the government. The best response OO has to this is, you can just pivot to Russia or China instead. Firstly, note that not all countries have the capacity to do this for the following reasons. Some economies are already deeply embedded within the Western economy. They have pre-existing trade deals. They work together in the past, so there's a time lag. They can switch to China overnight. But note that not all countries have a complementary economy with Russia or China, or they don't have good political ties. So this is not feasible in all solutions. And thirdly, Russia and China don't want secondary sanctions from the US because right now China is trading with the US. We aren't in the Biden, in the Trump era anymore. What this means is that selectively, in the few cases where this is smart, we can use that as a tool in the toolkit, and it does work in those cases, which is why CG wins top half.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Maybe half the member of opposition make a case for closing off.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay. Sorry, just one moment. Okay. The problem with most other teams in this debate is that they give reasonable harms or benefits that may result from economic warfare, but do very, very little to explain what the alternatives look like and why they are preferable. Before I move into that part of the extension, though, I just want to take out a few claims that we hear from closing government. Their first claim is that this mostly happens against smaller states. We're going to take them at their best and assume that this is true, but I just want to point out empirically right now, the main states that are engaging in this type of behavior, for instance, currency manipulation, are Thailand, Taiwan, Switzerland, China, and a couple of others. The main belligerent state empirically that engages in this type of behavior is China. What that tells us is that even if their case has a couple of structural reasons behind it, it just isn't based in reality. Their next claim is that there are going to be massive supply shocks that result from this. I just want to point out that in as much as your domestic industry is likely going to be brutally outcompeted, and as much as wealthier MNCs can then enter the area, lower labor standards to a significant extent, and it's going to be harder for you to export, it is similarly likely that a supply shock happens within the country on their side of the house. So they didn't explain the asymmetry of their argument, and if anything, it is more likely under their side of the house. I will engage with the rest of their claims about why you do this effectively within the extension. First extension, an analysis extension about why Gov's policy is unlikely to be successful. A couple of additional reasons. Firstly, countries don't respond to sanctions on their side of the house since they don't know whether or not their compliance will actually result in those kinds of sanctions being relaxed. And the main reasons for this is that often democratic governments, who all teams have agreed in this debate are the ones who generally are imposing these sanctions, often seesaw between political parties with differing levels of support for sanctions. So countries don't want to capitulate if they think that it's unclear whether or not sanctions will be relaxed in the future. And often there is a lack of clarity about whether or not sanctions will be relaxed in the future, especially in the age of populist presidents like Trump, for example, who randomly reimposed sanctions on Cuba and Iran for seemingly no reason. Secondly, you heighten on-the-ground movements against the West. We know this is empirically true. For example, when the US heavily sanctioned Iran, it bred the creation of the civil movement, which demonized the West. Now, the OG, to implicitly engage with this, says social unrest will emerge because of these sanctions. But the part of their argument they don't prove is why that anger will be directed at the incumbent government. Instead, it's likely that you direct the anger toward the West because the West is seen as an easy boogeyman. And this is different from opening opposition's mechanism because opening opposition's mechanism is dependent on the political parties themselves doing this demonization. But we explain why on-the-ground movements to whom these political parties are accountable are the ones who bottom up are going to be angry about this. Thirdly, let's give Gov their best case. They do bend. This does work. The problem is that then other parties come to power on the explicit mandate of the current party being far too weak on the West, which means that over time and in the long run, at the best case for Gov, it's likely that populism eventually emerges which opposes the West. Fourth reason, you get a race to the bottom, which eventually means that the mileage you get out of these sanctions is rough. For example, look at what's happening between the US and China right now. Initially, the US imposed a bunch of aggressive export bans on China. Now, China has imposed export bans on Micron, which is a chip-making firm that exists in Idaho, which has caused economic harms for the US. What this has ultimately meant is that you get a race to the bottom between the two countries where they keep slapping forms of economic warfare onto one another, which means that the ultimate utility you get out of it is relatively low. What are the strategic implications of this argument? Firstly, even if you don't think our reasons are as good as OO's for why this is unlikely to be effective, this at bare minimum means that Gov is unable to obtain their benefits in as much as we give new and unique reasons about why their policy is unlikely to work. But secondly, it beats the CG extension on why you do it well, because notably, many of these reasons function in cases where even if you impose sanctions in great ways, so let's take GovBench at their best and say you can do this in good ways, you won't turn to, for example, shell companies or hide your assets like OO says, or you won't inflame populist leaders like OO says. At Gov's best case, it's still unlikely that they will work because this is based on, for example, the internal perceptions the state has. For example, the perception of the state that you eventually, for example, you don't know whether or not the sanctions will be relaxed in the future. Secondly, what are the alternatives and why are they better on our side of the house? Firstly, the global economic order is going to exist on either side of the debate. What this then tells us is that instead it is better to work organically through the economic order. So for example, if you think that a particular economic practice in which a country is engaging is harmful, like IP theft, it is easier under our side of the house to, for example, go organically through the World Bank and use advising mechanisms that currently exist to encourage that particular country to gradually wean themselves off of that IP theft. And that is more likely to be effective because it doesn't come with the accompanying and sort of like demonistic threat that comes on their side of the house where you directly cut off ties with that country and impose economic sanctions. But secondly, let's say you do nothing. You have nominally good relationships. What does that mean? There's often a mutually aligning interest to cooperate with one another because of the network effects, the diplomatic effects, the eventual trade effects that you can get from working with one another, which means you can just exert direct leverage with these countries to eventually stop using these practices when it is good for them. It's more gradual, but hell, it's less likely to inflame tensions, as I already proved. But thirdly, OO makes the fair claim that sanctions stunt the economic development of such countries. For example, you're forced to open up your economy, which means that domestic industries can't grow. I want to add some crucial weighing to this claim. When your country is less able to develop, they feel more forced to remain in the position where they must continue engaging in these practices, meaning you don't eventually get a government which converges on stopping these practices. Before I move on, I'd love to take OG.
The threat of consequences is what prevents countries from wanting to engage in rule breaking in the first place, protecting smaller countries. All your impacts don't accrue for the 90% of countries that decide not to break the rules on our side, but will break the rules on your side.
Yeah, but the point is, you're still going to engage in this behavior because it is an economic necessity for you. I already explained why it does not work. So the threat doesn't have any teeth to it. It just makes diplomatic relations worse. So as I was saying, OO makes the fair claim domestic industries get outcompeted. The key weighing that they missed for this claim is that you are less able to develop, which means you don't eventually get a government and a set of economic policies that can converge upon not doing these practices anymore. So we may get this change at a slower pace, but what it means is that you are more likely to long-term get the countries to stop engaging in this critically bad behavior that everyone agrees in this debate are bad. So the key strategic implication of this material is that it fills in the missing burden of OO. OO gives many harms that could potentially result from this policy. They don't prove how they affirmatively solve any of the issues GovBench identifies. But finally, this just has massive offshoot harms. In many cases, large states which engage in this belligerent behavior often have other reasons that they need to cooperate with the West. For example, the West wants China to act as a mediator between Ukraine and Russia. If you piss China off in this way, China doesn't act as a mediator, so you don't get other way more important diplomatic objectives that you could get on our side.
And speaker for that speech, may we now have the whip to close off the speaking case.
Hello. My neighbors are cutting grass with the machine, so I just want to check whether there is like any noise in the background, or can you hear me fine?
Nope, no background noise. You're all good.
Okay, amazing. In that case, okay, POIs in the chat, please. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll just go team by team. So starting with the opening opposition. So firstly, what they say is that these dictators are going to be able to get away from this because they're just going to be blaming the West. Notice what we tell you in our analysis, how this is probably going to look like. We tell you that dictators, because of lack of economic, a lack of money and stuff like this, they have lesser means to consolidate the power and to be able to shift the narrative. If you have less money in the economy, this means that you are less able to pay the media to, demonize the West and all these sorts of things. But also, secondly, the main mechanism that dictators are using to consolidate the power is monopoly on violence, is military. When you are imposing targeted sanctions, you are sanctioning military leaders, which if they turn against you, then you are losing all your power completely, which means that we are able to do this when we have sanctions. And notice this is different than the opening government, because the opening government talks about targeted sanctions on oligarchs. We are talking about military leaders specifically, who are the ones who are able to consolidate the power. If they turn against you, then you are completely fucked. Secondly, they say, regime change is bad. Yes, regime change is potentially bad, but what we say is that this is not likely going to happen. What is likely going to happen is that you are scared of the regime change. You have seen the historical precedents when people were angry and hungry, and then they mobilize the paramilitary groups and they have killed the dictator. And this is something that has happened historically. We can see they have ousted Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. We have seen that they have literally killed Ceausescu in Romania because they were hungry, they didn't have medicine, and all these sorts of things. You are scared that this is going to happen to you, and therefore you are going to stop this bullshit, whatever you are doing, this violation of economic rules and stuff like this. But what is also important here, this is my POI to always important. The reason why you are doing this in the first place is because you want some kind of economic growth. If doing this is harming your economic growth more, then you are going to logically stop doing this. Like, these are rational people, they are going to logically stop doing this. Thirdly, they say that you are going to just switch your leadership style. You are going to be starting to focus more on ideology than on economy. It doesn't work like that, because you can't just say that people in this country will stop caring about the economy and they will just care about the ideology and the West. No, because hunger and poverty is something that is most proximate and most consequentially people are experiencing. When people are hungry, when people don't have jobs, when people are dying, this is literally the only thing that they care about and stuff like this. You cannot just say, we are just going to change the leadership style. You can't just do that. Then they say you are going to be aligning with the other actors such as China. 3 responses to this. Firstly, there are certain things that are unique that only West can provide to you. If there are certain products that only West can provide to you, such as semiconductors and this type of technology, you are not going to be able to get this from China. Second response to this is that you are still going to lose a huge market. Like, even if entire West, cancels you, you are still going to lose huge market, like millions of people, which means that you can sell your product to, which means that you are going to lose a massive amount of economic revenue. But thirdly, you cannot go with China if the entire USA sanctions you, because China fears secondary sanctions from the West onto them. Because what China wants to do they want to transfer their industry to the IT sector. For that, they need semiconductors. They right now don't have technology to develop semiconductors. They are dependent on importing microchips from the USA, from the West, which means that this is why this is something that, if you want to talk about China, this is something that also can function on China, because you do not want to fuck them over and stuff like this. And lastly, they say, but this is not something that countries are doing commonly. This is false. Countries are doing this very commonly. Why is this so? First of all, we can see that empirically, a lot of developing nations are starting the process of nationalizing resources. We can see this with lithium in Zimbabwe, lithium in Chile, they are trying to nationalize it. Indonesia is trying to nationalize nickel and copper and stuff like this, which is something that can lead to huge disruption of supply chain and also the more expensive products that are using these rare earth minerals. Secondly, very often what developing countries are doing is they're artificially dropping the value of their currency in order to make their exports more attractive, which is unfair to the other, countries. So we tell you that this is something that does happen fairly often, and it can cause huge harms on the supply chains and on the other developing nations, and this is why this is something that should not be done and stuff like this. Now, final weighing against opening opposition. First weighing is on the, even if I say some people are going to suffer, because their main harm is like people on the ground are going to suffer. Firstly, I want to challenge the extent of that harm in two ways. Firstly, if this is used strategically, like Robbie tells you, first we, freeze assets of military and all these people, then we try to like impose some export ban. This is not going to happen probably in majority of the cases. But second thing is that if this is something that is efficient and we prove to it it's going to be efficient, this is going to be a short-term harm. Short-termly, you're going to have bad economy, and then you're going to stop this policy, open up, and everything is going to be fine. But final weighing, even if they do prove harm on the scale and the magnitude of impact, what we explain to you is that this is something that is more people are suffering when you have supply chain shocks and when you have currency manipulation and stuff like this. So on our side of the house, less people are suffering. POI, yes.
So the elite and the military don't need semiconductors and are much more likely to want to look strong in the face of Western imposition. Why is it that they'll risk everything in the face of looking weak and
thank you. Well, for example, you need a lot of military technology, like for example, from the USA, if you still want to consolidate the power or something like that. Like I just put this as a random example, but you cannot say that China is selling all of the same things as the West is. Responding to CEO. So when they say, we are talking mostly about China, well, this is something that China is often doing, but we are not using this tool against China. We are using this tool when it is useful. Secondly, they say, you don't know if sanctions are going to be relaxed in the future. These are not political sanctions. You know that these are economic sanctions that you are going to, if you stop doing this is going to be enough. But also they say, the West does not have an incentive. But also we tell you that like West does not have an incentive to impose the sanctions for no reason, for all of the reasons Robbie tells you. Like you do not want to lose the exporter and the market and all these sorts of things. And like Trump is isolated example. Most of the politicians today are not populist, and even Trump is probably not going to get elected. Probably it's going to be DeSantis. And then they say, you're turning to China. I already deal with this. The reason why we weigh over opening government is because we prove to you why this framing is likely to work. They just assert it. But secondly, we also prove to you, we mechanize to you why this is something that is happening commonly and why is it bad. And for these reasons, vote for us.
And then given that speech, maybe now have the opposition whip and this debate as a whole.
Hi, can people hear me?
Sorry, did you say something?
Can people hear me now? I can speak up. Is this better?
Yep, much better.
I also cannot hear other people. Can people actually one sec. Like sorry, Matt and I have like tech issues because we're in the same room. So it sometimes takes a sec.
In that case, you might want to use Matt's device, if that helps.
I had this working earlier, so I should be able to get this to work. Can someone say something?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Okay. Never mind. I'm just gonna just click. One sec. Okay, cool. Sorry, just was figuring stuff out. Everyone good?
Yep, you're still audible.
Okay, perfect. I'm just gonna go through all four teams in this round, or all three other teams in this round and explain why we are beating them. First, I want to deal with OO and why I think that we are outweighing our opening team. OO has several claims in this round. First, they say it's likely not going to work to use sanctions. How do we outweigh these claims? One, as Matt points out, this is highly uncharitable to GovBench. For example, GovBench may be able to impose sanctions effective enough such that you cannot hide your assets. Our mechanisms function on the best case of GovBench as opposed to the ones that OO gives. Two, our mechanisms are more exclusive to the motion. For example, as CG points out, their arguments about nationalism or turning to China are non-comparative. You do this anyway, and OO doesn't prove why this specifically is the tipping point to trigger this impact. However, our argument on the perception that you never know when the sanctions will end functions independent of these political arguments and is just more likely to actually happen. This means you're less likely to actually do these things. Three, our mechanism on race to the bottom is a better mechanism that allows OO to access their impacts. A bigger reason that you turn to populism or to worse actors is because you keep slapping sanctions on one another, making things more and more hostile. So we give a stronger mechanism than OO does for their own arguments, meaning we outweigh them on this argument. Second, they say that you suffer poor economic conditions from sanctions. This is a cool argument. However, Matt adds the key weighing, which shows why this argument actually matters. If you don't develop enough, you never stop engaging in these things. This weighing is necessary for OG to have any impact, or OO to have any impact against the GovBench, and therefore they require our analysis and weighing for the impacts that they're giving to actually have any weight in the round. Third, we simply outweigh OO on the question of the comparative. OO barely talks about why the alternative is better at stopping these problematic behaviors. This makes them vulnerable to the CG argument that they give about supply chains. However, I think we explain how we reduce supply shocks affirmatively a couple ways. One, we can do things like get advising from the IMF or other global organizations that exist already without having to do things like impose sanctions and go outside of the sort of natural economic order that exists already and the institutions that exist within it. This is probably more like accessible to people. It also just seems less aggressive than doing things like imposing sanctions. Two, we think we can do things like organically negotiating. That is to say, we are more likely to be able to negotiate with other countries or with other states because we are more likely to be able to not be coming from a place of aggression or a place of like putting sanctions onto other states, and we can just negotiate with them. They are more likely to want to negotiate. And this also links into all of the arguments that Matt tells you about why getting a ton of anti-West sentiment is also really bad because it makes it really hard to negotiate. Three, we can also just do things like develop more. That is to say, on our side of the house, we provide links into why we are able to develop countries more. And all of this shows how we affirmatively flip the GovBench. This means we are more offensive than opening opposition is. While they rely on showing why Gov simply makes things worse, we are the only team in the round to provide you a positive alternative that can be done as opposed to just imposing sanctions. That means then that we have positive arguments that stand, but OO only makes defensive arguments about why sanctions are probably bad. We give you what that alternative would look like and we characterize it. I will take a POI from OG.
Malaysia used the economic freedoms from WTO rules to flood ASEAN markets with their domestic products. Then they use protectionism to make it harder for the Indo-China states to do the same thing. How does your bench resolve this?
We think that when you are able to use... Actually, I will get to this in a bit. Sorry, I'm not going to answer this right now. I will do this in a bit. Cool. I'm going to talk about GovBench. I'm going to start with OG, and then I will deal with CG. On OG, I think they don't really explain how sanctions are actually going to solve these things. They assert that sanctions are going to work in other places. They give examples that I think are just empirically untrue, like the example we get about Myanmar. I don't actually think sanctions worked super well or accomplished any of the goals that they are saying they did. This just seems untrue. But also, they don't explain why sanctions are actually going to create better incentives for countries to follow a global economic order. And presumably, if these things were so good and countries wanted to do them, they would have already done them. I'm unclear why sanctions are the push, and I don't think OG provides a specific mechanism why sanctions are the tipping point for any of their arguments about countries like complying with the global world order or being good. But even if we buy their case, it doesn't really seem worth the trade-off that they establish, because the only way for OG to access the impacts that they give in this round is to place people into poverty, because the sort of mechanism that we get from them is like, maybe people will get upset, which will make the government care or do things like revolutionize. One, I don't think these revolutions are necessarily inherently good, but two, we just think it is probably bad if people are getting super upset, because the reason people are getting upset is that they do not have access to things like food or basic things. But also, Matt flips this argument by showing where you get on-the-ground movements that are actively against the West. This worsens the ability to ever integrate or get a better economic order later, because you now have massive amounts of anti-West sentiment that have been created and will manifest later down the line. We think then OG1 doesn't explain how they get to these impacts, so we just have much stronger links into our arguments. And two, even if OG gets a country to stop a certain policy, they're just likely to link into long-term worse economic harms later. Lastly, I want to talk about CG. a bunch of responses here. I think it is likely that across GovBench, they never actually prove how sanctions get to the sort of policies, and they're not likely to actually work for the reasons that they're saying. First, the states in the world right now who are engaging in belligerent actions are mostly just China, who is a big state. I'm unclear what these like small states that these are going to be used against are. So it is unclear how reasonable that this will even be actually done in small states. GovWhip says that we aren't doing this against China right now, but this is just a lie. We are doing this. We are sanctioning China. These are the sorts of things that we are doing. Second, countries don't respond to sanctions well because they have no idea if sanctions will actually be relaxed if they comply. Their strategy is likely to just keep doing what they're doing and not capitulate because either they don't want to be seen as weak or they don't know that these sanctions will even be done in the first place. Or they'll be like actually relaxed if they capitulate the thing that the West wants. This makes these sanctions empty threats that also have the downside of potentially making the global economy much, much worse. And I think we prefer not enforcing the global economic order to actively making it worse. Third, you just increase the amount of anti-West sentiment that exists. This anger gets directed toward the West because the West is a really easy person to blame. So this means that even if Gov is getting some of their impacts on these claims, it probably comes at the expense of a bunch of anti-Western sentiment. Fourth, Gov drops Matt's responses on why supply shocks happen on their side of the house too. This means then their extension is premised on this happening, but it's probably so if it doesn't, then their downstream impacts are just worse on their side of the house and they don't get them. On the weighing here, even if Gov gets their best case, you probably get populism that is bad for the West. I think this links into the arguments of getting a race to the bottom on GovBench, meaning that even if in the short term sanctions are okay, you are likely to trigger more economic warfare, more economic unrest in the long run. This links into things like long-term economic consequences. And if we care about a global economic order, we also want to avoid things like big recessions. Lastly, just overall takeaway of this round. I think Offbench has proved that sanctions won't create the change that Gov says they will, but CO is the only team in the round that provides an alternative that actually solves something that OO fails to do. Very proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech that also effectively ends this particular round. I would request the convener to take down the stream right now. And yeah, see you guys in 15 to 20 minutes. Once we are done, we will call you in. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, has the stream been taken down?
Oh, yes, we finished streaming.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's